All right. So last time we left off with the conclusion of the war, with the Americans having come in and tipped the balance in favor of the Entente powers. We talked about some of the reasons that happened, and today we're really going to be looking at the consequences bear, the big consequences bear. Because U.S. intervention in the First World War is going to determine the arc of European history in the 20th century. This is not a class about American history, and so especially in our lecture about the 1920s, you all might be expecting something to do with roaring or something. It's not going to be that way at all. It's not going to be that way at all. Because unlike the United States, which does actually experience a real period of boom and euphoria from about 1922 to 1928, there really is no similar period in Europe. Things are very bleak. Unemployment rate remains very high. Currencies remain very unstable. There are several instances of very high inflation. One case of really bad hyperinflation, which is very famous in the Weimar Republic, where you have the pictures of the wheelbarrow of paper money. Have you seen those pictures where someone's going off to buy a loaf of bread and they have the wheelbarrow full of paper marks? Okay, so, and one of the chapters in that book actually deals with post-war inflation. So, a couple of just quick things to note about the upcoming days here, because I'm going to depart somewhat from the path I laid out in the syllabus. Again, this is my first time teaching this. This is kind of a trial run here, if you will, and so I really appreciate your feedback. I'm going to spend today breaking down the multiple treaties that are negotiated at Versailles, or dictated at Versailles. However, it's really dictated by the winning powers, negotiated by the winning powers, the big powers in particular. It all just kind of gets lumped under this generic label of the Treaty of Versailles, but there are going to be 5 treaties that are negotiated, which deal with various aspects of it. If you would please consult, I know all of you have your electronic devices with you. We will be moving to a different room next week. For now, you can each pull up the PowerPoint for the week on your various electronic devices, whether it be phone or laptop. Again, just let me know once you have found a chapter that you would like, and you can just yell it at me and I will jot it down.
I'll do one.
One, what was the name of it? Sorry.
It was called The Temper of the Times.
Yes. Okay. All right.
I do 5.
5, and what was the name of that one? Sorry, I just don't remember the name.
Disarmament and League.
Ah, yes, the League of Nations. We'll be talking about that. And I'm sorry I was not able to find a digital access for that one. I am going to try and avoid that, but that's really one of the best books on the interwar period, the best book as far as I've found.
6, Soviet Union.
Oh, of course, right? Of course. All right. I will be 100% honest with you. That is probably the worst chapter of the book. It is worth reading, but he is British, and so he has all of the Russophobia a typical Englishman has. So, forewarning. It is highly instructive. He's got lots of great little tidbits in there on things. Of course, it's an inexhaustible subject. An inexhaustible subject. Yes.
I'll do 13.
13. That one is really interesting. Really, really interesting. It really reminds me of the same kind of dynamics that occur.
Is it possible for me to do 2?
2. Which one was 2?
No, I mean like 2 chapters.
Sure.
Can I do chapter 9, which is the Weimar Republic, and 13, which is Nazi Germany?
Sure.
If I'm looking at post-war Germany, I think. that'd be-
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. I have the PowerPoint brought up as well so that I can follow along, just in terms of which slides I had where. So we're going to spend today looking at the treaties, looking at the reasons the treaties shook out the way they were, and then I'm going to set the stage for us moving across to Eastern Europe.
Can I do chapters 6 and 7?
6 and 7, which were they?
Soviet Union and Eastern Europe.
Oh, the Eastern Europe chapter is actually my favorite one.
Ooh, can I have that too?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have like
Yes,
the
yes.
exact same topic.
Yeah. That one is actually one of the one of the best chapters because I was actually just about to say this. We're going to set the stage for talking about the Russian Revolution. We're going to kind of jump back because the treaties of Versailles are going to kind of segue naturally into some territorial settlements, which are going to produce territorial disputes. And so at the end of the Great War between the great powers, you're going to have a war between a bunch of these new, the war of the pygmies is what Churchill described. The war of the giants is over, the war of the pygmies has begun. So all the little successor states that they create in Eastern Europe are going to battle each other for territory. And this is going to get tied into the broader Russian Revolution. And so then on Wednesday when we meet, I'm going to stop us here right as we start getting the ball rolling on all these conflicts between the various powers like Poland and Czechoslovakia and all those, the Greco-Turkish war. I'm going to stop at the end of the day there, and then we're going to jump back on Wednesday and kind of bring the Russian Revolution forward to that point, and then kind of snowball our narrative there. The discussion board will probably be about these topics. Monday, we will continue and sort of establish the Bolsheviks securely in power. We'll basically go all the way through the civil wars. And then on Wednesday of next week, we will be taking a look at Europe once things are kind of, quote unquote settled. It's going to be highly unstable. Eric Hobsbawm and Norman Davies we both read who have very different perspectives on these events. Both seem to agree that generally it's helpful to think about this period, 1914 to 1944, 1945, as just one long period of European civil war. And it's true that there's conflict on the continent and within the states on the continent almost every single year. So let's start. Did I have anyone else waiting to pick a topic? One, two. Yes, just waiting on yes.
I just don't know which one it should be.
Yes, it's very tough to choose just one. Okay, so one of the most obvious outcomes from the war are territorial changes. If you flip to slide number 3 on the PowerPoint, you'll see a picture of Europe before, in 1914, and then after, right? And what do we notice? All of a sudden, there's just proliferation of states in Eastern Europe. Everything from Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland is brought back. Poland, which had been out of existence since the 1790s, the third partition of Poland. Poland is feasted upon and devoured by its neighbors, something I believe I mentioned in the context of one of our earlier lectures. As you can see, Italy gets a little bit bigger, but not as big as it wants to. That's going to be very problematic and lead to some grievances there that Mussolini will be able to effectively exploit. As you can see, Austria's domains are really broken up, and we're going to talk about this in the context of the peace because this is one of Woodrow Wilson's real brainchilds. A lot of the British establishment actually want to keep the Austro-Hungarian Empire together. They foresee nothing but ill from the breaking up of these states, and we will get into why that is. Let's see, Greece. You have Greece is going to battle Turkey for possessions there, the Greco-Turkish War. Bulgaria, Romania. Romania is going to be enlarged a little bit. Bulgaria is going to be cut into a little bit because, of course, Bulgaria joins the Central Powers, so they're going to be punished for doing that. Russia, as you can see, that Russia is going to lose some territory. This map in 1919 is not the greatest map in the world, but it's an okay map. One of the reasons I don't like it, well, unless I had originally had a slide with a bunch of different maps, because these territorial changes sometimes happen month by month, right? There's going to be an independent Ukrainian state for a little bit here before it is swallowed up in the wars of the Russian civil wars. Sorry, were you able to decide on one?
Yeah, I was thinking maybe 2.
Number 2, and which one was number 2?
That's the peace treaties.
The peace treaties, yes. That's a very fascinating chapter because it's hard to do justice to it. Without being able to sit down, having written books myself, it's much easier to sit down with your collection of notes and write really great, dense, compact sentences that are just chock full of great information. I'm going to do my best here in the course of this lecture to at least provide the broad contours of what's going to happen here. So take a look at the map. This is what's going to happen here. Large territorial consequences of the First World War. So let's start with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, since I was just talking about it. the Austro-Hungarian Empire is going to be broken up into its quote-unquote constituent parts. We talked about the Austro-Hungarian Empire being sort of known as the prison house of nations, being made up of lots of individual ethnic groups. One of the problems is that ethno-linguistic homogeneity is something that is only able to be maintained at a distance, right? The closer you get, the more homogeneous populations seem to be. Even apparently very mono-ethnic linguistic populations like Japan, if you actually really zoom in, you find that there are actually a lot of non-ethnically Japanese who are there, because of course Japan is an empire itself to this day. For example, Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia is going to be the home of the Czechs and the Slovaks, right? But you're going to have a decent amount of Ruthenians, a very large number of Germans, some Poles, right? So basically what happens is, instead of one big Habsburg empire, you're going to get a bunch of smaller little Habsburg empires that are just these messes of competing ethno-linguistic groups, okay? And this is going to be highly problematic. And one of the reasons that wars are going to break out is because these powers are going to be fighting over territory when they get recreated. Poland, for example, the newly recreated Poland pushes to have its borders reconstituted to where they were in the 1770s, before the first partition, which the other powers view as unacceptable because, to the point about the Russian revolutionaries, they are not convinced, the Western powers are not convinced that this revolution is going to take hold, and that, regular imperial Russia is going to come back in, and they want to basically hold on, hold in reserve Russia's territory for it, for once they, eliminate these crazy revolutionaries and get the monarchy back on its feet there, or, maybe a republican government, whatever the case may be, but they don't want to have Poland cutting too far into, Russian lands, if you will. Of course, they're going to change their minds. Yes?
If Russia was one of the victors of World War I, why did they lose so much territory?
Okay, so if you recall, yeah, did you want to say something?
I was just curious, as I noticed, was looking at these maps. Did Finland become independent at this point? Because
These are both great questions, and they tie right into each other.
1914, the map is kind of zoomed in, so it might not just be being shown on the other one it shows, but
Okay.
didn't Russia control Finland during this time?
So, those are great questions, and they tie right into each other. If you recall, one of the ways that Lenin consolidates power is by ending the war. And he signs a very advantageous treaty, advantageous to the Germans, that is, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and I'll just read it off here. Russia, due to its signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, becomes the size it had been in the 16th century. This is crazy. I mean, this is late 1500s. Russia has not been this small in hundreds of years, right? And so on the one hand, that is why those territories are where they are. Now, I'll get into this, but one of the provisions that the powers are going to want in the German surrender is an agreement to abrogate that treaty, to rip that treaty up. First, let me address Finland. Finland was a province, a semi-autonomous province of the Russian Empire. When the revolution happens, they break away. They basically say, well, we're not going to be ruled by the Bolsheviks. You bet your dollars on that. And Lenin essentially, initially, settles on a policy, and we're going to get way more into this, so I'll just keep it very superficial right now. Lenin decides on an initial policy of national self-determinations for the minorities. And so he just basically lets them go.
Well, except then they tried to take it back over.
Oh yes, eventually they are going to. Oh yes, once he consolidates power, then they're going to fight wars to try and get them. And in the meantime, Joseph Stalin is busy establishing worker Soviets in these countries to have sort of a parallel structure of power, so that they'll have a way to foment problems for these governments. Yes, it's really just a question of practical politics at this point. They don't have the forces to take care of suppressing a war like that.
Is that Northern Ireland?
Oh,
So that's
okay.
World War I.
Okay, so Northern Ireland, how to describe, where did Northern Ireland come from? So going back to the English Civil Wars in the 1700s, basically in order to solidify their control over Northern Ireland, the English are going to send a bunch of Protestant landlords over, right? And they're essentially going to rule over the country. It's going to be terribly unpopular. during World War I, the Irish, the Catholic Irish population, the actual Irish population, is going to be very nervous that they're going to be drafted into the British Army. There's going to be an uprising. The uprising is going to be put down very brutally, and then in the aftermath, there's going to be a deployment of a paramilitary force by the British government, very unpopular, called the Black and Tans, and they are essentially going to try and repress Irish sentiment. And even though, again, it's so funny because the British government, you could always count on them to eventually do the obvious thing, right? Just like they fight the war against, the South African Republic, they fight against Canadian self-deterrence, Australia, and eventually they just raise them all up to the level of, Commonwealth dominions, right? When really that was all they had to ever do in the first place. I think about the fact that I sometimes think about the fact that had Parliament, the British Parliament, simply been willing to acknowledge that the British Americas could control their own taxing policy, the internal affairs, and that London just determined foreign policy, the British government probably would have controlled all of North America, right? And would they have won World War I without any problems? Would Germany ever even have challenged the British Empire, right? Because what did the American Revolutionaries want? They wanted their local legislative bodies to have the same taxing power, the same representative qualities as the English Parliament had. It's what the Australians will eventually want. It's what the Canadians are eventually going to want, right? And it's what eventually the British government is going to give all of them anyway, right? And it's like they had just not been so pig-headed. Anyway, alternate history conjecture there, but none of them wanted to really revolt against the British Empire. They were Brits, so anyway, yes. Yes. Okay. And then, actually, very interesting. De Valera is the name of the guy who is spared after the Easter Rising, and he's spared because he holds an American passport. He holds an American passport, and he will be sent back to the United States, and he will be returned as the eventual president of the Irish Free State, and he will keep Ireland neutral during World War II. So very interesting stuff. I didn't really have time to talk about that, but the Germans were trying to foment problems for Great Britain using Ireland during World War I. This wasn't really a class about World War I. It would be great to have just a class about the Civil War period in Europe. Yeah.
So I'm also on this map. So I know why. So Poland was given access to the Baltic Sea.
Yep.
Baltic. But why did they leave East Prussia in control of Germany? Why? Because they took out parts of like Latvia. They made all these countries from the German Empire. Why were they just like, oh, we'll also leave East Prussia?
Yeah.
Like, was there an actual logic behind that, or was that just kind of like a?
Well, the goal was to have a settlement that kept Germany alive, essentially, as a player and as a willing participant. So there's this tension, and we're going to talk about this. There's this tension between this desire to punish Germany and weaken Germany, but also have a Germany who's willing to not challenge this settlement, right? And so they're trying not to make the Germans too angry, right? And this is something that they're going to not bother with at the end of World War II, right? At the end of World War II, they're literally going to obliterate Prussia entirely. Like, there is no Prussia. There is no place called Prussia after World War II. They literally write it right out of there.
Doesn't that become
right?
part of Russia? Is that roughly what college is?
Yes, it falls behind the curtain. Yep, that all does. From Stettin to the east there, which Stettin is that great Baltic access there to the sea. Okay, so we talked about this. So Russia, gives up all that territory. Germany. Let's talk about Germany. So Germany, apart from being stripped of its colonial possessions in places like Africa and East Asia, and these will be divided up between the Entente powers. Germany is also going to be stripped of Alsace and Lorraine, which go to France. Significant parts of West Prussia and Upper Silesia, which both go to Poland. Memel, which goes to Lithuania. And the Saar Basin, which is part of the industrial lands, is going to be nominally a League of Nations mandate, but it's effectively going to be controlled by the French. Further, the Rhineland is going to be demilitarized, key fortresses destroyed, and then the treaty is also going to stipulate that Germany and Austria, our two great German powers, are strictly forbidden from merging together, a process called the Anschluss. And for those of you who've watched Sound of Music, you know that that's what's happening there, right? When Baron von Trapp and them come back and the Nazis are rolling in, the Anschluss. Yes.
Random question, is that law still in effect today? Austria and Germany still no longer, like, do they still have that rule where they can't merge? Because
You know, that's a great question. I don't know. So much has happened since then.
Like, did that just sentiment completely die
They had
out
such,
then?
yeah, I was gonna say they had such divergent trajectories after that. Of course, Austria is not a member of like NATO, right? Austria is not a NATO member. They never were. They were a neutral country during the Cold War. They have a much closer relationship with Russia, for example, in states of like Hungary than does Germany. So it's an interesting question. And also, you know, would Vienna want to be subjugated to, which is frankly, you know, what you're doing. You would be being subjugated to the more powerful Germany. Germany is far more powerful now than Austria was. I think if that merger was ever going to happen and have it stick, you know, the time for that has probably passed, even if it's not still on the books as being prevented, which I'm not sure if it is. The Ottoman Empire. This is going to be huge for later in our End of Empires week. The Ottoman Empire is broken up, okay, and one of the things that the Treaty of Versailles, one of the treaties of Versailles is going to do, is it's going to try and obfuscate a little bit, because the Americans, who were underwriting a lot of this and who are the reason that they're there and not having to cut basically an equitable piece. If the Americans had not entered, the Germans either would have won or it would have been just a straight up draw, which frankly would have been preferable in my opinion, but it's neither here nor there. That's not what happened. The Americans do not want the British and French imperial spheres to increase. They don't want them acquiring more colonies, especially out of the old Ottoman domains. And there's a specific provision about the rights and wishes of the people and how they're not going to be colonial subjects, the people of the non-Turkish people of the Ottoman Empire. So they create what is called the mandate system. These aren't colonies anymore, these are mandates. And we, the British, or we, the French, these aren't really our colonial peoples. We're just here trying to help them learn how to govern themselves and all of that, you know, very condescending sort of stuff. And of course, they're colonies, right? They're colonies. The British are going to take Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, and Syria, while the French effectively take control of Lebanon. There's going to be a very famous map that we're going to look at, drawn up by Sykes and Picot, who are basically just a couple of random, you know, foreign office guys for the British and the French, and they basically draw the lines of the modern Middle East. That's why they're so like perfectly straight and stuff. If you ever looked at that, but that's why those lines are the way they are. I'm not going to get into the Balfour Declaration right now. We're going to, again, group that into some later stuff. Probably post-World War II, when Israel is actually created, is when I'll circle back around. But just know that in order to gain the support of, for example, the frankly very powerful Jewish business class, people like Lord Rothschild in London, who was an avid Zionist, the British government essentially decide that they're going to issue a very ambiguously worded statement. If you've ever read the text of the Balfour Declaration, it's clearly written by the most judiciously minded lawyerish type, right? Because on the one hand, they've already promised all this land to the Arabs, right? Who they've been stirring up. Lawrence of Arabia, T. Lawrence, if you guys know. Lawrence, if you know anything about him and his adventures, we will obviously talk about that in the context of a later lecture, I've already said. Arab nationalism. So they're promising two things to two different people, and it's not possible for both things to really happen, right? On the one hand, they're saying we view with favor the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine, accepting, of course, that the rights of people therein will be respected with regard to and such and such and such and such, so that they can basically tell everyone, hey, we did exactly what we said and make no one happy. We did the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that because these are the wars that we're going to focus on as we move east towards Russia. I already said Poland isn't given all the territory it thinks it should have. So it immediately starts jumping on its neighbors trying to take territory. There are some battles, and these battles are going to go on for about 2 years. So from 1919 to about 1918, 1919, 1920, 21, there's going to be like rolling conflicts among all of these powers. Let's see, especially among the Balkan states who are still trying to start. They, of course, we had talked about there were multiple Balkans wars right in the lead up to World War I as they were fighting over territory there. And then, of course, there's going to be the Greco-Turkish War, which is still, there are still disputed islands today. I believe the last conflict, the last shots that were fired in that conflict were like in the 1960s, and they've never officially. There are several islands that are like literally divided right in half. Yeah, and Cyprus being the most important. Yeah, so okay, so beyond territorial sessions, the territorial sessions. They are kind of the most obvious thing. You look at a map and it's like, oh wow, obviously a lot of things happened there, right? Some other big things that are going to happen. Financial reparations. So first of all, we have the German armies in the field, and we have the German government back in Berlin, okay? These two things are not really the same. So just to jump back into the war for a minute, the generals basically being back to Berlin, they say, oh my gosh, we're being pushed back, we might have to sue for peace. The government immediately starts to panic, and the situation is very unstable, there's a lot of social unrest. They decide to start communicating with the Allies, with the Entente powers. The German military then kind of changes their mind and says, no, you know what, actually I think if we just pull back to a more defensible front, because as the Germans are being pushed back, they're not actually being pushed into Germany. The Entente armies never entered Germany. The Germans won on the Eastern Front and didn't lose on the Western Front. Bulgaria was defeated. The Turks were defeated. So their ally, and Austria crumbles, obviously. So like their allies were defeated, clearly. Their coalition was clearly smashed. And had the war continued, it's almost certain, it would have costed probably 1 million American lives. The Americans lose about 200,000 in the one real big year of fighting that they do. But it's without question, had the war continued, Germany would have been like World War II. It would have been total victory. But it's not. It's a negotiated peace. Remember, I said the French were suffering mutinies. Everyone is sick of war. The British are, having uprisings in Ireland. Their people don't want to fight the war anymore. The Germans, they look at Woodrow Wilson and they say, well, Woodrow Wilson has said repeatedly that he wants the peace to be on the basis of these 14 points. I'm going to read these 14 points to you real quick. These are actually just summaries I broke them down because it's Woodrow Wilson, so he's very long-winded. I broke them down. 14 points. Open diplomacy. Woodrow Wilson really believes that the First World War was in part driven by secret agreements. We talked about the secret military plans that had been worked out beforehand by all the different powers, especially the British and the French. Basically saying we need to have open covenants, openly arrived at, no more secret diplomacy. Freedom of the seas, fighting over like ports and territorial access and things like that. Free trade, no more barriers to trade, because then if I need nickel or I need rubber, and I don't know that I can go access it freely by just paying you, for it, I have a huge incentive to just capture that supply, right? This is one of the big drivers of colonial policy, right, and imperialism, is, well, we're going to lock up these raw materials for ourselves to guarantee access to it. They did sell them to one another, of course. The powers were huge traders among each other. But the idea was, in the event of a war, they're going to cut off our access to it, and we're going to be in big trouble. So he's saying free trade. That's the impetus for free trade. There's a whole series of things that are going to develop out of liberal principles like democratic peace theory is one of them, and development theory, and these all kind of tie together, which say that like democracies and free trade, all of that will make for more peace. And free trade removes the need to fight over resources. That's where free trade fits into that matrix. General disarmament. We talked about the huge arms races that had taken place beforehand, and how it had put a lot of pressure on the situation. colonial self-determination. That's one at the conference. The Japanese delegation, which the Japanese were on the on-town power side, they present a motion to have the conference acknowledge the equality of all races. And Wilson and the British and the French are all like sort of flabbergasted. And they're like, what? Why don't we talk about that later? And then they, of course, table that and never get back to it. And this is actually one of the things that really, the Japanese were very honored. I mean, honor was still a huge thing in Western culture at the time, but it was like still a huge part of their culture. And I was just reading a book by a historian by the name of Barrett, who's talking about that particular slight being something that, along with the Washington Naval Conference, which will happen a few years later, where Japan is going to be told, no, you're not allowed to have the same naval power as Great Britain and the United States, even if you have the industrial capacity for it. And so they really start to view the world system as being highly racialized, and that they're going to have to carve out a sphere for themselves, in spite of the powers. I believe I had mentioned that the Western powers had taken away some of Japan's territorial names in the Sino-Japanese War, and then the Russo-Japanese War. This is getting way ahead of things. I don't think I'll ever mention it, but in the war crimes trials afterward, one of the Japanese commanders who's being tried and who's eventually hanged, he says, "We learned from you." And it was as though, having learned how to play poker, and been sat down at the table and getting good at the game, all the other powers decided that poker was now immoral, and us wanting to play was a crime. And he's not entirely wrong about that. Non-interference in Russia. Woodrow Wilson actually didn't want the powers to interfere in what was going on in Russia. Very interesting, and we're going to get into exactly how these interventions in Russia get started and what the impetus was, and especially how it played into early Soviet propaganda. Because one of the things that is critical when you're trying to consolidate power is to get people to rally around you. And what helps people rally around you more than anything else is an external enemy. An external enemy. So that's a real huge gift, propagandistically, to the Bolshevik regime, is that the Western powers and Japan do get involved. So it's a huge gift, huge gift. The restoration of Belgium. Remember, Belgium's neutrality had been the reason the British had been, the reason the British had gotten into the war in the first place. The Low Countries there, you hear them called the Low Countries. That for years. I mean, they literally fight a series of wars, the Anglo-Dutch Wars, way back in the 17th century. And for years, for the centuries after that, to keep control of those channel ports. They never wanted an unfriendly power controlling those ports. So like a neutral Belgium and Netherlands and stuff, that was always a huge British security interest. The return of Alsace and Lorraine to France. Alsace and Lorraine, I don't think I had mentioned this, but like they had gone back and forth multiple times, going all the way back like 700 years. So, redrawing the Italian borders. Remember Woodrow Wilson, he's big about the right of national self-determination. And to him, all the Italians should be in one state. And so, there are people living in, quote unquote, Austria who speak Italian. We should draw the lines to bring them into Italy. Place like Trieste, for example. Redrawing the borders of Central Europe to reflect the ethno-linguistic nationalist ideal. And again, that's something that, if you're standing very far away, seems fine. Like, oh yeah, Slovakia, there's a bunch of Slovaks. It's the land of the Slovaks. And then you get closer, and you realize that it's actually a huge hodgepodge. And like, yes, the Slovaks are maybe predominant, but it's like 55%, right? It's not like 95% or something like that. And again, when you have control of your state, what are you doing? You're establishing your language as the official language, your religion as the official language. The schools are teaching your history, your culture. And so minority rights, one of the things that, there were a million different things, but the current round of fighting between the Russians and the Ukrainians, one of the things that the Russians had complained about, and that Putin specifically had brought up, was that Eastern Ukrainians who spoke Russian and who were Orthodox weren't being allowed to be instructed in that language in the public schools. Because of course not, right? It's a Ukrainian state, and the public school and the army are your nation-building tools. Remember, the Italians show up, and they're heading down into Lake Sicily and stuff, And they're so foreign that the Sicilians think that these are Englishmen. They think that these North Italians are Englishmen. So they have to get them in the public school, get them in the army, teach them what it is to be Italian or Ukrainian or Russian, or whatever the case may be. Self-determination for the Balkans, self-determination for the non-Turkish people within the former Ottoman Empire. We talked about that already. And then the formation of the League of Nations. The League of Nations. The League of Nations is sort of your proto-United Nations. It's exactly what it is. It's going to utterly fail. Why is it going to utterly fail? Because you need, frankly, to have all the large players concerned, the people who could by themselves change the status quo, you need all of them signed on. You just do. You just do. And with the United States, spoiler alert, you guys all know this, Wilson is not able to get the U.S. Senate to pass the League of Nations. So the United States does not ever enter into the League. You guys all know that. Okay. So without the United States, the only people who are trying to enforce this peace are Britain, who's very much weakened and want nothing to do with the continent. They're trying to keep their empire together. And the French, who've just been bled to death and are in horrible financial situation, right? And so you've got you've got Russia, the USSR, who they're trying to keep out. You've got all these weak successor states who are fighting among each other and who won't coordinate action. This is something the French are going to realize, because the French are going to try to set up an alliance to kind of keep Russia out and keep Germany in a box. But these states, they won't coordinate with each other. They don't trust each other. And so without having all the powers on board, there's no chance that the United Nations is going to stand up to anything. Of course, the United Nations is the League of Nations is going to be tested a series of times. It's going to be tested in it's going to be tested, number one, by the Italians and the Japanese. The Japanese are going to start moving into Manchuria and into China. The League is going to be powerless to prevent them doing this. The Italians are going to move into Abyssinia, modern Ethiopia, where they are not only going to violate the League of Nations. The Ethiopian emperor shows up to plead his case in the European arena and is just basically told, well. I mean, I'll get to why the powers do this. There are calculations, because the British think about it, but the British already have one eye on Hitler Germany at this point, and they think that they can keep Mussolini on their side against Hitler, and so that's one of the reasons that they don't slam because they probably could have handled the Italians. They could have bullied the Italians into doing what they wanted, but and then of course Nazi Germany, right? So you have these revisionist powers who very slowly start testing the League. Right? Is the League actually going to be able to protect the territorial integrity of small states? No, right? No, they're not. And so the territorial settlement is not going to hold. Those are the 14 points. And again, the treaty, and I'm going to go through some of the other provisions of the treaty here to really emphasize why the treaty was not popular, why these treaties were not going to be able to form the basis of a state of peace. Because one of the things that's going to become clear, I think, is, let's see, yes. So, the War Guilt Clause. Let's start with the War Guilt Clause. So, the Germans think that they are surrendering on the basis of the 14 points. They understand that there's going to be additional things laid on them. There are some German revisionist historians after the war who essentially say, we were tricked! We were tricked! Wilson said we were going to have this peace with no victors. We were all just going to be buddies, you know? No. The literal instrument of surrender that they signed in the railroad carriage says that there are going to be, I believe it's 8 other additional demands, right? 8 other additional things. Things like handing over the fleet, handing over the German fleet, handing over X amount of your heavy guns, of your artillery. So it's like, and there's going to be some amount of financial reparations. So it's clear that, like, okay, there's going to be some pain here. There's going to be some additional pain here. But they're not expecting what they get. They're not expecting this. Losing all that territory, number one. Being hit with a reparations bill for the entire cost of the war. The entire cost of the war. It's going to be 132 billion gold marks which in today's dollars is like over $1 trillion. So imagine you got your war-torn economy, you're basically bankrupt, and they're like, all right, we calculate you owe us $1 trillion, right? $1 trillion. And this comes from the War Guilt Clause. Article number 231, I'm going to read it in its entirety here. The Allied and associated governments affirm, and Germany accepts, the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies. And let's just recall how this war started. Who remembers, how did the war start? How did the war start?
Oh, let me make sure Serbia.
Serbia, right, okay. So the Serbians assassinate, right? The Austrians mobilize to smack Serbia. The Russians say, we can't let you smack Serbia. The Germans say, well, we can't let Austria lose. And the Russians are going to bring the French in, right? Because the French and Russians have an alliance, and Germany's going to be caught in a war on two fronts. And so the Germans are arguing, look, we basically did this out of self-defense. I'm not arguing that it was self-defense, right? But it seems to me very obvious that World War I is not a case of, well, you had this evil guy named Hitler who was really driving the action. It was just a series of arrangements, a series of forces that were combining in ways that, even though none of the leaders, except for maybe the Austrians, wanted even a localized war, they just couldn't stop themselves. And we talked about this in the lecture about the days leading up to World War I. You know, Tsar Nicholas saying full mobilization, partial mobilization, full mobilization. You know, Kaiser saying, are you sure that we have to go, you know, to total war here? You know, Kriegsbereitschaft is what it was called. The preparation for imminent war. Because this was the equivalent of like declaring war, basically. Because the Germans could mobilize so quickly because of their amazing railroad network. This was basically, if they declared a state of imminent war, it was going to prompt the French to immediately mobilize. And it was just, again, they were going to have to go through Belgium. The British government had already decided that if war happened, they were going to come in on the side of the French. So, you know, it's one of those things that today, I've mentioned it before, very scary stuff, the very scary parallels. Because World War II, when we see World War II, it's really going to be a consequence of, you know, the ambitions of a few men expressing the grievances that emerge out of World War I. And some of these grievances are things like the reparations. This is going to cripple Germany, right? Germany is going to experience bouts of hyperinflation. And what does hyperinflation do? Hyperinflation. So you are a nice middle-class guy. You've been saving some money, thinking about retiring here in about 10 years maybe. You've got 1,000 marks in your bank account or something like that. Hyperinflation happens. What happened to the value of all your savings? Gone entirely. Eric Hobsbawm, the historian you were reading, his grandfather told him about cashing a life insurance policy that he had that came due. That came due. And he said the total payout from the life insurance policy was barely enough to get a drink at the local bar, right? You paid all this money into this insurance policy, but because of hyperinflation, the money that they're paying out to you is basically worthless, right? This is going to destroy the savings of the middle class. It's going to destroy business. It's going to make any government that was associated with the Versailles settlement, with the policies that came from it, extremely unpopular. And we talked about the fact that there's going to be a lot of internal discontent within states. And there's going to be a lot of conflict between sort of the radical left and the radical right. That is the ultra-nationalist conservatives and sort of the communists and socialists. Open clashes in the streets between, you know, like thousands of dudes armed with like actual military equipment, right? So prior to the war's outbreak, you essentially had a nice condominium of the centrists, right? You had sort of the small L liberals, you know, the people who were maybe okay with like parliamentary republicanism, who didn't really like democracy, but who wanted the rule of law and free trade and capitalism and things like that, kind of partnering with the old conservatives, the sort of moderate conservatives, who were willing to allow for things like an open meritocracy, didn't want democracy, but wanted industrialization and growth and things like that. You had this nice condominium there that's completely destroyed by the war. The British Liberal Party never recovers. The British Liberal Party still exists, but how do they do an election? Like they were literally destroyed by the war. Literally destroyed. The liberals in Germany are, of course, destroyed by the war. There we go. Sorry, this keeps closing on me. Did I hit all the things? Oh yes, disarmament. Disarmament, sorry. So reparations, which are going to severely handicap the German economy. The loss of all these territories, which are German, right? Which are German territories filled with German people who speak German, who are now going to be in other states where they're going to be a quote-unquote oppressed minority, right? Their kids can't have instruction in German. They're being forced to learn, Czech or Polish or something like that, right? This is going to be a huge complaint of Hitler when he demands the Sudetenland, right? When he demands access to things like Danzig. Disarmament's going to be another thing. The Germans are not allowed to have an air force, a navy. They get to have like a couple surface vessels for like basically Coast Guard duty. And their army can't exceed 100,000 men, which is like the size of like a fifth-rate power. Like this is nothing, right? This is hopelessly small. So they've been humiliated, right? Humiliated. They're broke, and they've been forced to accept responsibility for a war that I think I've gone to great lengths to show you is like it's all of their faults and none of their faults. It's definitely all of their faults, but it's hard to point to any specific person. And the German minister who's presented this document to sign, and he says, we in no way reject responsibility for our part in the starting of this great war, but we categorically reject sole responsibility for it having been waged in the way that it was for as long as it was. Another thing that's going to be very unpopular is that after this is signed, that after the German army surrenders and everyone goes back home, the blockade that the British have been imposing is going to remain in place, and over 100,000 additional German people are going to be killed as a result of starvation. And yes, that is going to be a huge grievance. Hitler is the politics of grievance at its absolute peak, right? Like the politics of grievance, we see that today. Like Hitler is like that at like its absolute peak, and that's one of the things that he's going to play on. Ferdinand Foch, who I introduced two lectures ago, he's one of the French commanders who starts to have some battlefield success, and he's actually the marshal. I believe he's the marshal of France when the war ends, and he is one of the negotiators at the Treaty of Versailles. The most famous dissenter of the peace treaties was, of course, John Maynard Keynes, who immediately writes a book called The Economic Consequences of the Peace, where he argues that this is not going to hold, another war is inevitable, you have to rebuild Germany and reintegrate it into Europe if this is going to hold. Ferdinand Foch, he writes, this is not a peace, it is an armistice for 20 years. And what year did World War II start? Assuming that you ignore the Japanese invasion of China and Manchuria.
39's all around.
Literally 20 years. Literally 20 years later. So it's often tempting to read history backwards, but in this case, it seems very obvious because you read countless people at the time who were participating saying, this is a terrible idea, it's never going to work, and yet it was all they could really hammer out. Yes?
When did you say that?
At literally, literally right after the conference. He leaves the conference. A member of the American delegation resigns during it and writes a book about it, which you can find at, what's his name? Because you can find it at the Mises Institute's website. All of their books, they have PDFs of them for free. I read it at one point. But yeah, and they literally, all these guys say the same thing. They're like, look, Germany, this is going to cause a lot of grievances. The ultranationalists are eventually going to take power in Germany. France is not going to be able to hold down Germany by itself. Britain has been fatally weakened by this war. The United States isn't going to want anything to do with this. They're not even going to agree to be in the League of Nations, And we're not going to be able to, prevent the Bolsheviks from coming this way because we're not going to be able to establish an effective coordinated security policy, which ultimately, the reason that the Bolsheviks don't wind up overrunning Eastern Europe is going to be a result of a combination of a couple of strategic defeats in the civil wars, which we're going to talk about next time, and also a strategic decision by Joseph Stalin, who's going to take power. Lenin is going to die actually fairly early on in the process. He's not even going to last, I think 5 years in power. He's going to be incapacitated largely after a failed assassination attempt. A bullet strikes him in the neck, I believe, the neck or the head. But so that's what I have for you today. The treaties at Versailles. They established the successor states of Eastern Europe. They established the reparations that are going to be fixed on Germany. They disarm Germany. They shrink it down. They take away a lot of its industrial capacity. However, the French are then basically just going to be left alone on the continent. The Americans are out of there. The British are out of there. And they're basically leaving the French there. Say, all right, you wanted this peace. You know, the British were really annoyed with the French. They were really annoyed with the French. Because the British, remember, the British hadn't really had any permanent reason for disliking Germany, Prussia, Germany, except that Germany was now going to build this massive battle fleet and maybe threaten British domination on the seas. Now that Germany was defeated and had no fleet, I mean, the British government had no objection to them being a powerful continental power again. It was the French. It was the French who said, no freaking way. Not going to happen. Georges Clemenceau, who's the French minister, is basically the one driving this forward. I hate to blame him for it, but he is really the most vociferous hater of the Germans. And then, you know, I try and put myself in his shoes. You know, growing up in that, you know, you were humiliated by the Prussians. They used you to unify Germany. They took away, you know, French provinces from you, and then they provoked this war, and it killed all of your countrymen. Remember, I said of French male children born in the year 1890, a third of them will be killed in World War I. So I mean, we're talking about losing like a whole generation of guys. And everywhere you go down the street, you have reminders of the war, because one of the things that is going to be, medicine has gotten to the point now where they can sterilize things, and guys aren't dying of infection, right? Civil War, you get shot in the arm, they amputate your arm, you die of like infection, right? And you're just dead. Well, now they have sterile treatment stuff, so you have amputees who are living, guys who have been horribly disfigured by shell explosions and gas attacks, like walking the streets. So the memory of the war is very much with you. Like, the dead aren't just dying and being interred in some cemetery where it becomes an abstract idea. It's an everyday reminder of the war. And it's going to be very much a part of European society in the 1920s, which we will start talking about next week, because starting Wednesday and then into Friday, it's time for the Russian Revolution. Any questions before we leave today? Okay, I will make those printouts for you all. Please let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. I'm going to set up a library day, so if there are any days